It, of course, prevents a lot of pollution from going out into waterways, but there's a lot of room for improvement as well. And that's, but I mean, for one example, treating phosphorus as a toxic is one example. Like, phosphorus is one of the major. You remember going back to when you talk about nutrient cycling, the major global nutrient cycles are carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. So it's actually very necessary. It's in all of our DNA. Phosphorus is a fundamental atom in our DNA. So it's definitely not something that is toxic. We all need it. So part of the idea, and people are looking at this, is right now it takes a bunch of oil and energy to produce fertilizers. Right? That process of making nitrogen from the air available to biological organisms into organic form is extremely energy intensive. But of course, it's necessary. The only way that we can grow enough food to feed the billions of people on Earth is through fertilizer production. That was the Green Revolution. And right now, a lot of that fertilizer ends up running out into waterways, causing various problems that we've talked about too, hypoxia and low diversity in coastal areas. A lot of nitrogen is in waste, and so both phosphorus and nitrogen. So the fact that we do all this processing, and some of it gets returned into fertilizers, but in many ways, I mean, you all know that manure can be a fertilizer, right? So why not try to develop a system where instead of we can use most human manure for fertilizer? Right now, that's difficult to do, but proposals including what's called gray water sort of do that. They say we don't actually need to clean all of the wastewater. We can divert a lot of it for fertilizer purposes, right? You get out whatever it takes so it doesn't. You don't want to like spray human feces onto fields. It's going to smell bad, but you can do minimal amounts of processing required to allow that water to be reused, rather than having an energy-intensive industrial process to completely clean it and then say, now we have a bunch of clean water. What should we do with it? So these are part of a lot of civil engineers, industrial engineers, urban planners are working on innovating all of the industrial systems that allow a city to function in a way that is not, that people would still want to live in cities. So you also get a lot of pollution, and this is an obvious thing. So Newtown Creek, I think we mentioned before, one of the most polluted waterways in the United States. It's the little creek that separates Brooklyn and Queens, just north of Greenpoint. Gowanus is another issue. So a lot of people, there's a lot of New York Times have written about this. Just since Hurricane Sandy, all the flooding that's happened, if flooding comes from Gowanus or Newtown Creek, if your basement got flooded from those waters, you've got a lot more issues besides just water damage. Right now you've got all these industrial pollutants in your basements, and the cleanup becomes a lot more difficult of a process. So in some areas, you just had seawater, you've got to do some cleanup, but in areas that are flooded by industrial waterways, your house is a toxic site until you have, basically it has to be as a top professional cleanup in order to be habitable again, all on top of the water damage. And remember too, like when you talked about the water system in New York, one theme of it was that New York City chose to be innovative and take an ecosystem services approach as opposed to an engineering approach that is typical. So what we see in a lot of the industrial systems that are designed to lessen the impacts of the magnitude of pollution issues that come from cities these are kind of in that whole engineering technical solutions mind frame, where those people have very little training in ecology or the idea of ecosystem services. So there's a lot of opportunity to try to combine and bring into a more ecosystem services, ecological approach to our urban system, causing low diversity in aquatic systems by feeding algae at the top, which then block out light and cause a whole reduction of trophic diversity below that. There's other impacts as well to and also what happens when you get these issues is that many beach closures are due to bacterial growth, some of which where those bacteria have their origin in feces, and some of which are generated by the nitrogen, the phosphorus that's leaked out of water by creating these huge algal blooms. There's controversy. It's uncertain why in some years the algae that grow because of nitrogen output are just harmless algae except for their effects on hypoxia, on blocking out light. But in other years, the algae that are grown are brown algae, so we call them, and then you get red tides where the algae are actually toxic. So then the beach has to be closed because you've got toxic bacteria growing in huge numbers in waterways. And that's all, again, one of those other unplanned impacts of how we're affecting ecological systems. And then other issues, so right now, like as the video said, it's really only about 80% of the stuff that's filtered out. So we're still a fairly inefficient process. So if you measure water in any area around any urban area, and it's going to be much worse outside in developing areas than in the United States, you're going to get measurable amounts of feces in the water, and plenty of other stuff as well. For example, pharmaceuticals, like any drug, people are flushing their stuff down the toilet. People take more drugs than they need. It goes into the toilets as well. So there's measurable amounts of aspirin, acetaminophen, caffeine, all these chemicals that we're ingesting that are in the products around us make their way into water as well. So by no means do we have a system where we're really effectively filtering out a lot of this water. And again, many of these are bioactive, and it comes back to the means that nature uses to filter water is through wetlands. Wetlands grow where they grow precisely because the organisms that are there are adapted to filtering out nutrients from water. It's collected by all the process of decomposition and so on that happen further upstream. We have basically tried to engineer solutions, but our engineering in many ways is not as effective as the process of evolution through millions of years of history. So that's another argument for why wetlands should be a part of our wastewater stream. So that's actually an idea that people have brought up. So that there's a common thing of creating marshes alongside water treatment plants and allowing plants to do a lot of that filtration, so that we don't have to use an industrial process. And they will end up taking up a lot more of these things that our industrial systems are not as good at. Okay, so we've also got solid waste. And another part of the video talked about how right now much of what is filtered out from water gets shipped to the local landfill. Is this a sustainable solution? So right now, almost everything that we have, we all are going through disposal pods every day. It all still gets pretty much dumped into a big landfill somewhere, and then, and there's not really a long-term plan for a lot of these landfills, right? It's just kind of a stopgap solution. We just figured the Earth is so big that it can handle it. And of course, now and recently, we're starting to realize that there's got to be better ways to figure out solve the trash problem. So until about 20 years ago, almost all of New York City's trash went to fresh kills, which is a dump in Staten Island. It, at its highest, was taller than many of the skyscrapers that are in Manhattan, the largest dump in the world. And I mean, you can just imagine. I mean, all of the trash that New York City generates every day is a huge amount of trash, and it's all going to one place. And this is just, it's just literally an ocean of trash. Not just an ocean in terms of the spatial extent, but how deep it is. So this thing is, again, the height of the skyscraper. So you've just got almost unimaginable amounts of trash out there. So of course, you can only dump New York City's trash into one area for so long. A couple decades ago, a deal was made with New Jersey to ship trash to dumps there, and now a lot of trash is just shipped all kinds of places. New Jersey, Virginia, barges are loaded up on Manhattan, and the trash is just shipped to contracts with landfills in a bunch of different states. So it's not like the problem is solved; it's just being redistributed. There is a nice side of the story. Right now, Fresh Kill's under development to be a park, and when it's completed, which of course is a major process because you've got a lot of processing of hazardous materials there, it's expected to be, I think, the second largest park in New York City after some of the parks in the Bronx. Helen Bay, I think, is the biggest. So a lot of the issue with trash, how can we solve that problem, is a design issue, right? That gets to where many products that we that are currently end up in landfills are designed for their living life, not for the end of their life. So that's true of like all the wrappers, your bags of chips, the plastic bag at the grocery store, where people are like, well, yeah, you all know those issues. These things are designed because they're cheap and light during their life, right? The people who design plastic bags, and this is just one example of millions, are only designing it for that 20 minutes or whatever it is between the grocery store and you take it home, right? There's no thought at all to what happens after that 20 minutes of use, right? And so we just figure, oh, just take out a landfill. They at least crumple down really small so they don't take up a lot of space, so we can put a bunch of plastic bags into the landfill. But of course, they don't degrade. And you can imagine that there should be, there probably are better solutions to that. You know, I'm not an engineer, so can't really say, but I do know that one overall theme, I think that I mentioned before, is that the way that we use organic versus plastics, in some ways, is kind of the opposite of what it should be. It makes sense, you know, to build a deck, for example. Like many decks are built out of wood, and what happens is that the deck weathers, it gets splinters, it's got to be retreated, it warps, it requires re-engineering. And a deck is supposed to be a semi-permanent type of thing. So why use organic materials for that, where you could use synthetic material that's going to be longer lasting, much more resistant to the weather, and serve all the functional purposes of the deck? And you know, it can be made to like look nice as well. It doesn't have to look ugly. So right now we kind of use organic materials for a lot of goods that are supposed to be durable and long lasting. Another example is books. Right? So some people argue that right now with a book, books are basically intended to last indefinitely, right? It's not like a magazine where it's supposed to just be used for a week or something. But why use paper? Why do we need to deforest trees for something where we know that paper acidifies over time, it's going to degrade, it's going to yellow, it's going to be vulnerable to insect pests that eat organic material, right? Should our books be made organic, or should that be a longer lasting material, some type of a plastic that can also have the benefit of having an ink design where if that book is at the end of life, the ink can be easily removed in a non-toxic way, and that plastic can be repurposed for something else. Right? And then the other end of things, all of our disposable goods are made of the cheapest plastics and are permanent. So your bag of chips, all wrapping on like supermarket stuff, you get a box of cereal, it's like in a little plastic bag. There are all these things that are only used for minutes to hours, last forever, except they last forever in a landfill. So we've kind of got this inversion of, and the reason is because of costs in terms of that stuff. So I think I mentioned before, but in India, which just to bring out because I have more experience with that, when you see like what are the traditional modes of disposable stuff, it's very different from what we have now, right? Like so, people drink a lot of tea there. So on trains, they serve tea. They serve the tea in little ceramic cups. They're ceramic, so they're not light, but they are cheap. And then when people are done, they just throw them out the window. And then the next time it rains, they basically dissolve in. And I'm sure there are plenty of ecological problems with, whatever's painted on them or whatever. But now Indian Railways is switching to plastics, and so now when you look out on the railways, it's like a nice view if you can screen out the bottom half of your view, right? Because that's where all the trash is that people still throw out the cups, but now those cups are going to last forever, so there's no degradation. You have street food in India. The traditional way of serving it was on leaves that were tied together with twine, and so basically it just becomes a plate or a bowl. They even have well-formed solid bowls that can hold liquids that are just made of leaves and organic materials. It's probably pretty labor-intensive, but it's an organic solution for something that has a very short lifespan. And it was all done not out of design, but because that's what was built. They didn't have a big plastics plant that could produce really cheap, disposable goods. And of course now, there's this whole paradox that a lot of people have pointed out in India and other countries like that. They want to be modern and Western, and so part of that means having a disposable bag of chips, having a plastic plate to eat from, plastic forks and knives, and so on. And they're adopting, in many ways, some developing countries are adopting some of the worst practices ecologically, that the West is